African American Civil Rights in the Roaring Twenties. The Rosewood Massacre of 1923. Rosewood was a small town in central Florida, and a town that had been heavily influenced by the revival of the KKK. An angry group of white men entered an African American part of town because of a rumor that Jesse Hunter, a black male, had sexually assaulted a white woman. A group of 3 white men scouted the area and believed that Jesse Hunter's cousin was hiding him as a fugitive. 3 days later, the white men returned with a mob of about 30 others and went to Jesse Hunter's family home and shot various members of his family. The black men of Hunter's community fought back, killing 2 white men, but in total 6 African Americans were either lynched or shot. The Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. In May of 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland was accused of grabbing the arm of a white woman working as an elevator attendant. Rumors ran rampant throughout the town and community, and by the next morning, 2 mobs, 1 African American and 1 white, started rioting in front of the city courthouse. Gunshots were fired, and things quickly became worse as the African Americans retreated and the white mob continued to attack. The white mob attacked and looted most of the business district, and the governor of Oklahoma declared martial law and sent a National Guard to oversee the issue. All in all, 6,000 blacks were imprisoned, 800 people were injured, 35 blocks of Tulsa were burned to the ground, and about 300 died. Moore v. Dempsey. Moore v. Dempsey was a case tried in 1922 involving the death penalty being handed down to 12 African Americans and then being successfully appealed after efforts made by the NAACP. In 1919, 12 African Americans were accused of killing 5 white men during a riot between 2 mobs, although the most plausible theory, according to historians, is that the whites accidentally shot one another. The men were tried with an angry white mob chanting threats of lynching outside the courthouse, an all-white jury, and dealt with torturous methods to try and get the men to falsely confess. All 12 were decided to be guilty by the jury in less than 8 minutes. NAACP Representative Walter White went undercover until he got to the bottom of the situation and soon enlisted local attorneys to help him overturn the rulings. Eventually, all 12 men were freed. Eugenics and sterilization. In March of 1924, the state of Virginia passed the Eugenical Sterilization Act. Each case of sterilization was presented to a special board where it would be deemed passable or not. The practice soon became popular in other states. Any patient afflicted with hereditary forms of insanity or imbecility was subject to sterilization. The U.S. Supreme Court decided it did not violate the 14th Amendment and the right to due process in the case Buck v. Bell of 1927. 22% of sterilization victims were African Americans at first, most of whom were African American women. However, it soon became difficult to maintain a growing population in the South, and many white doctors abused eugenics on African American women. The percentage of sterilization victims soon grew to about 40% African American and ultimately about 60% African American. The rebirth of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan resurgence of the 1920s spread much further than just the South. It became popular in the West and Midwest, with one of its largest strongholds located in Indiana. If the Klan, not judges, juries, constitutional rights, or due process, decided that you were guilty of breaking the law, bootlegging, and other things like that, then you would be subjected to what they deemed fair punishment. The most common methods of punishment were whippings and tar and featherings, but for African American victims, being lynched was unfortunately all too common. This resurgence of the Klan equated being American to being a white Protestant, and targeted anyone who was not their idea of American, i.e. African Americans, Jewish, Catholics, and immigrants. However, its specific and persistent targeting of African Americans was much more severe than other races, and the punishments were much more cruel. Movements and events like the Harlem Renaissance led African Americans to a more important place in society in some aspects, but to do so they continued to sacrifice or commercialize their traditions to please the whites. African Americans also continued to suffer under mistreatment by other members of society, governmental policies, and the force of white members of certain communities.